Picture this. You're a young princess, barely 15 years old, standing in the cold stone corridors of a foreign castle. Your wedding gown weighs more than your entire body, encrusted with jewels that catch the flickering torchlight like tears frozen in time. Tomorrow you'll marry a man you've never met, sealing an alliance between kingdoms with your own flesh and blood. But tonight, as you lie awake in your chamber, you hear whispers from the servants about what awaits brides who displease their new husbands. They speak of devices hidden in castle dungeons, instruments designed not for common criminals, but specifically for women of noble birth who fail to fulfill their matrimonial duties. You pull the covers closer, trying to block out the sounds echoing from somewhere deep within the castle walls. Is that screaming you hear? Or just the wind through the ancient stones? Your ladies-in-waiting exchange nervous glances, but none dare speak of what everyone knows but no one acknowledges. In this world of political marriages and dynastic obligations, your value lies not in your happiness, but in your ability to produce male heirs and maintain absolute obedience to your husband's will. And if you fail in these duties, there are tools waiting in the darkness below that were crafted specifically to remind royal wives of their place. This was the terrifying reality for countless royal brides throughout medieval Europe, where marriage was not a union of love but a political transaction sealed with human currency. Behind the pageantry and celebration of royal weddings lay a darker truth that historians have long whispered about but rarely documented in detail. The very castles that hosted magnificent ceremonies also contained chambers where disobedient wives learned the true cost of defying their husband's authority. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the horror that awaited some royal brides, we must first understand the world that created these nightmarish tools. Medieval marriage among the nobility was never about personal choice or romantic love. It was about land, treaties, and bloodlines. A princess was essentially a living document, her body the parchment upon which political agreements were written. From the moment of her birth, her entire existence centered around her eventual ability to cement alliances through marriage and produce legitimate heirs to continue her husband's dynasty. But what happened when these human treaties failed to deliver on their promises? What became of the princess who couldn't conceive, who gave birth only to daughters, or who dared to question her husband's authority? In an age where a woman's value was measured solely by her reproductive success and absolute submission, failure carried consequences that extended far beyond mere disappointment or social embarrassment. The medieval mind operated on principles that seem alien to our modern sensibilities. Women were considered inherently inferior beings, prone to sin and deception, requiring constant supervision and correction. This wasn't just social prejudice, it was codified in law supported by religious doctrine and enforced through institutions that gave husbands almost unlimited power over their wives. A royal bride entered marriage knowing that her husband possessed not just her wealth and lands, but her very body and soul. Within this context, the torture devices used on royal brides served a dual purpose. They were instruments of punishment, certainly, but more importantly, they were tools of psychological control designed to break the spirit of women who had been raised with some measure of independence and authority. A commoner's wife might be beaten with a stick or locked away, but a princess required more sophisticated methods of subjugation. These women had been educated, had wielded some political influence, and understood their own worth in the complex game of European politics. Breaking such women required tools as refined and calculated as the political marriages that had brought them to their fate. The first device we must examine is one that specifically targeted the most intimate aspects of a royal bride's existence: the chastity belt, though not in the way most people imagine. Popular culture has given us images of crude iron contraptions used to ensure fidelity during a husband's absence, but the reality was far more sinister and psychologically devastating. The actual chastity devices used on royal brides were sophisticated instruments of humiliation designed to remind women that their bodies belonged entirely to their husbands. These devices came in various forms, each more horrifying than the last. The most common was a metal apparatus that could be locked around a woman's waist and between her legs, featuring sharp internal protrusions that would cause excruciating pain with any movement. But the true torture lay not in the physical discomfort, but in the complete loss of bodily autonomy. A royal bride subjected to such a device could not perform the most basic human functions without permission from her husband or his appointed guards. Imagine the psychological impact on a woman who had once commanded servants and influenced political decisions, now reduced to begging for the key to relieve herself. The device served as a constant reminder of her powerlessness, making every moment of every day an exercise in submission and dependence. Court records from various medieval kingdoms contain veiled references to such practices, often disguised as concerns about ensuring the legitimacy of royal heirs or protecting wives from their own supposedly sinful natures. The second category of devices specifically targeted royal brides who failed in their primary duty, producing male heirs. Medieval medical understanding attributed fertility problems entirely to women, viewing infertility as a moral failing rather than a biological condition. A royal bride who failed to conceive, or worse, who repeatedly gave birth to daughters, faced escalating punishments designed to correct what was seen as her fundamental inadequacy as a woman. The fertility frame was a device that restrained a woman in specific positions thought to encourage conception, forcing her to remain motionless for hours or even days after intimate relations with her husband. The frame itself was constructed of wood and iron, with straps and clamps that held the victim in place while metal spikes or heated implements pressed against sensitive areas, supposedly to stimulate the womb into proper function. But even more horrifying were the internal devices used to correct fertility problems. Medieval physicians, working with the blessing of husbands desperate for male heirs, developed instruments that could be inserted into a woman's body and left in place for extended periods. These devices, often made of heated metal or studded with sharp points, were believed to encourage pregnancy through constant irritation and pain. The agony was considered necessary medicine, and a royal bride's screams were interpreted as evidence that the treatment was working. Court physicians kept detailed records of these procedures, describing them in clinical terms that masked their true nature as systematic torture. They wrote of encouraging the feminine humors and correcting the wandering womb. But their notes also document the psychological breakdown of their royal patients. Women subjected to these treatments often developed what we would now recognize as severe trauma responses, becoming withdrawn, refusing to eat, or exhibiting behaviors that their contemporaries attributed to madness or possession. The third type of device used on royal brides targeted those who dared to assert any form of independence or authority within their marriages. These were women who questioned their husbands' decisions, who attempted to maintain correspondence with their birth families, or who showed insufficient enthusiasm for their conjugal duties. In a world where a wife's complete submission was considered essential to social order, such behavior required immediate and decisive correction. The bride's bridle was perhaps the most symbolically cruel of these devices. Designed specifically for women of high birth who spoke too freely, it consisted of a metal framework that fitted over the head like a cage, with a spiked plate that pressed against the tongue. Any attempt to speak would drive the spikes deeper into the mouth, making conversation impossible while allowing the wearer to breathe and consume liquids. But the psychological torture went beyond the physical pain. The device was often decorated with symbols of submission and obedience, transforming the wearer into a living reminder of the consequences of female independence. A royal bride wearing such a device might be paraded before court gatherings, her humiliation serving as entertainment for nobles and a warning to other wives who might harbor thoughts of defiance. Even more insidious was the way these devices were integrated into the daily life of the court. A husband might require his wife to wear her bridle during meals, forcing her to eat in silence while conversations flowed around her. Or she might be made to wear it during religious services, her inability to participate in prayers serving as a public declaration of her spiritual inadequacy. The device transformed every social interaction into an exercise in humiliation and powerlessness. The fourth category of torture devices reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval attitudes toward royal brides: the belief that a woman's beauty and sexuality were dangerous forces that required constant regulation and punishment. These devices targeted the physical attributes that had initially made these women valuable as political assets, systematically destroying the very qualities that had led to their marriages. The vanity scold was a device designed to punish royal brides who were deemed too concerned with their appearance, or who attracted unwanted attention from other men. The apparatus consisted of a metal mask that covered the entire face, with openings only for the eyes and small holes for breathing. The interior of the mask featured sharp protrusions that would cut and scar the face with any movement, while the exterior bore humiliating decorations depicting women as animals or demons. A royal bride forced to wear such a device would find her legendary beauty transformed into a source of constant pain and eventual disfigurement. The psychological impact was devastating, as these women had been raised to understand that their physical attractiveness was their primary asset in the political marriage market. To have that asset systematically destroyed served as both punishment for past behavior and insurance against future transgressions. But perhaps even more cruel were the devices designed to punish royal brides for their sexuality itself. Medieval religious doctrine taught that female sexual desire was inherently sinful and dangerous, requiring constant suppression and correction. A royal bride who showed too much enthusiasm for intimate relations with her husband, or worse, who was suspected of adultery, faced instruments designed to make sexuality a source of agony rather than pleasure. These devices, too graphic and disturbing to describe in detail, were designed to make the most intimate aspects of marriage into exercises in pain and humiliation. They transformed what should have been private moments between spouses into opportunities for systematic torture, ensuring that royal brides learned to associate their own sexuality with suffering and shame. The administration of these tortures reveals another horrifying aspect of medieval royal marriage: the complete complicity of court society in the systematic abuse of royal brides. These were not secret crimes committed in hidden chambers, but openly acknowledged practices supported by law, religion, and social custom. Court physicians provided medical justification for the tortures, describing them as necessary treatments for feminine disorders. Religious authorities blessed the devices as tools for correcting moral failings and ensuring spiritual salvation. Legal scholars wrote treatises explaining how such punishments fell within a husband's legitimate authority over his wife. Even the royal bride's own servants and ladies-in-waiting participated in her torture, either through active cooperation or willful blindness to her suffering. These women, often drawn from the nobility themselves, understood that their own futures might depend on their willingness to enforce the system that oppressed them all. They helped restrain their mistresses during the application of devices, maintained the instruments between uses, and kept detailed records of punishments administered. The psychological impact of this universal complicity cannot be overstated. A royal bride facing torture knew that she could expect no help from anyone around her, that her suffering was not only accepted, but actively supported by everyone in her social circle. This isolation compounded the physical pain of the devices themselves, creating a total environment of helplessness and despair that broke even the strongest spirits. The records that survive from this dark period reveal how thoroughly these practices had become woven into the fabric of royal life. Court chroniclers wrote matter-of-factly about the correction of royal brides, describing elaborate ceremonies where the application of torture devices was treated as a formal court function. These events followed strict protocols with specific roles assigned to various nobles and servants, transforming systematic abuse into ritualized spectacle. One particularly chilling account from a 14th century French court describes the education of a young queen who had dared to question her husband's military strategy during a public council meeting. The chronicler writes with bureaucratic detachment about how the queen was fitted with what he calls the crown of silence, a device that pressed heated metal against her scalp, while sharp prongs extended down to pierce her tongue if she attempted to speak. The ceremony took place in the Great Hall before assembled nobles, who applauded each stage of the process as if witnessing a theatrical performance. What makes these accounts so disturbing is not just their casual cruelty, but the way they reveal how completely society had accepted the systematic torture of royal women as normal and necessary. The chronicler notes with approval how the queen's feminine pride was properly humbled, and how her subsequent silence during council meetings demonstrated the effectiveness of her correction. He describes her changed demeanor, the way she kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded, her voice barely above a whisper, as evidence of successful rehabilitation rather than traumatic breakdown. The devices themselves evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and psychologically targeted as medieval understanding of human psychology grew more refined. By the 15th century, court torturers had developed instruments specifically designed to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of royal women. These were not crude tools of physical punishment, but carefully crafted mechanisms of psychological destruction. One such device, referenced in Italian court documents as the confessor, was designed to extract admissions of guilt from royal brides accused of various failings. The apparatus restrained the victim in a kneeling position, while mechanical arms positioned sharp implements at various points on her body. The torture began with light pressure that gradually increased until the victim confessed to whatever crimes her husband had accused her of committing. But the true genius of the device lay in its psychological design. The victim could see exactly how much pressure was being applied and could watch the mechanisms that would increase her suffering. She was forced to participate in her own torture by speaking her confessions aloud, making herself complicit in the process that destroyed her. The device transformed the royal bride from victim to collaborator, forcing her to betray herself in ways that ensured lasting psychological damage. The confessions extracted through such means were then used to justify further punishments and to create legal records that portrayed the tortured women as inherently criminal and untrustworthy. These documents, preserved in various European archives, paint pictures of royal brides as manipulative, lustful, and dangerous creatures who required constant surveillance and correction. Modern historians reading these records must remember that they represent not factual accounts of royal behavior, but the coerced testimonies of women broken by systematic torture. The seasonal nature of royal torture reveals another layer of calculation in these practices. Court calendars show that certain devices were traditionally applied during specific times of year, often coinciding with religious festivals or political events. A royal bride might find herself subjected to particular torments during Lent, with her suffering framed as penance for her sins. Or she might be tortured during harvest festivals, her pain serving as a symbolic offering to ensure the kingdom's prosperity. These seasonal patterns served multiple purposes beyond the immediate goal of controlling royal wives. They created anticipation and dread that extended the psychological impact of torture far beyond the actual periods of physical suffering. A royal bride might spend months dreading the approach of Easter, knowing that tradition demanded her participation in what court documents euphemistically called devotional exercises. The calendar itself became a weapon, transforming time into an enemy that brought inevitable suffering. The integration of torture into religious observance reveals the depth of medieval society's commitment to the systematic abuse of royal women. Church authorities not only blessed these practices, but actively participated in their development and implementation. Bishops and abbots served as advisors in the design of new devices, contributing theological justifications for increasingly elaborate torments. Religious torture devices designed specifically for royal brides often incorporated sacred symbols and biblical imagery in ways that perverted spiritual meaning into instruments of suffering. A device might be decorated with images of the Virgin Mary, forcing the tortured woman to associate the Mother of Christ with her own agony. Or it might incorporate elements from the crucifixion, transforming the central symbol of Christian salvation into a tool of feminine subjugation. The psychological impact of this religious integration cannot be overstated. Royal brides were typically devout women who found comfort and meaning in their faith. To have that faith weaponized against them created a spiritual crisis that compounded their physical suffering. They could not even pray for relief without being reminded of the religious authorities who had blessed their torment and declared it holy. Court records reveal how thoroughly these practices had corrupted every aspect of royal marriage. Wedding ceremonies themselves often included ritual elements that foreshadowed the bride's future subjugation. The exchange of rings might be accompanied by the presentation of miniature torture devices, symbolic reminders of what awaited wives who failed in their duties. Wedding gifts from noble families frequently included elaborate torture implements, their craftsmanship and decoration making them suitable for display in royal chambers. The wedding night took on particularly sinister dimensions in this context. What should have been an intimate moment between newlyweds became an opportunity for the husband to demonstrate his authority and the bride to learn her place. Court physicians often attended these encounters, ostensibly to verify consummation, but actually to document the bride's submission and to apply corrective devices if her behavior was deemed insufficiently compliant. The morning after the wedding, court ladies would examine the bride for signs of proper submission, checking for bruises and marks that indicated successful correction. These examinations were recorded in official documents that became part of the royal archives, creating permanent records of each bride's introduction to married life. The bride's reactions during these examinations, her tears, her attempts to hide injuries, her pleas for gentleness, were interpreted as evidence of her character and used to determine what additional training she might require. As we delve deeper into the specific mechanisms used to break royal brides, we encounter devices so sophisticated and cruel that they challenge our understanding of medieval society's capacity for systematic evil. These were not the products of individual sadism, but the refined results of centuries of collective effort to perfect the subjugation of royal women. Each device represented the accumulated knowledge of generations of torturers, physicians, and legal scholars working together to create more effective methods of feminine control. The evolution of these instruments reveals a troubling pattern of innovation and refinement that suggests medieval society devoted significant resources and intellectual energy to the project of royal bride torture. Court records show payments to skilled craftsmen for the creation of new devices, correspondence between kingdoms sharing techniques and designs, and scholarly treatises analyzing the effectiveness of various approaches to feminine correction. This systematic approach to torture represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval royal marriage. The transformation of individual cruelty into institutional practice, personal sadism into social policy, and human suffering into political necessity. The devices waiting in castle dungeons were not aberrations or exceptions, but integral components of a system that reduced royal women to political commodities whose value could be maintained only through systematic terror and control. The devices used to enforce absolute silence upon royal brides represent perhaps the most psychologically devastating category of medieval torture instruments. These contraptions were specifically designed to rob women of their voices, transforming articulate princesses who had once commanded audiences and influenced political decisions into mute shadows of their former selves. The most infamous of these was known as the golden tongue, a device that appeared beautiful from the outside but concealed horrific mechanisms within. Crafted to resemble ornate jewelry befitting a queen, it consisted of a decorative metal plate that fitted over the mouth, held in place by chains that wrapped around the head like a crown. But hidden behind the gilded exterior were rows of needle-sharp spikes that would pierce the tongue and inner cheeks at the slightest attempt to speak. What made this device particularly cruel was its public nature. A royal bride wearing the golden tongue could attend court functions and state dinners, appearing to participate in royal life while being completely unable to contribute to conversations or defend herself against accusations. Courtiers would engage in elaborate charades, asking the silenced queen questions they knew she couldn't answer, then interpreting her desperate gestures as signs of guilt or defiance. The psychological torture intensified when these women were forced to witness their own replacement in court discussions. Husbands would openly consult mistresses or female relatives on matters that should have been the queen's domain, making it clear that a silent wife was no wife at all. The golden tongue transformed royal brides from political partners into decorative objects, their presence serving only to remind everyone of the consequences of feminine speech. Even more insidious were the devices designed to punish royal brides for their emotional expressions. Medieval society demanded that noble women maintain perfect composure at all times, viewing any display of genuine feeling as evidence of feminine weakness and instability. A queen who wept too openly at a funeral, who showed anger during political disputes, or who expressed too much joy at celebrations, faced instruments designed to teach her emotional restraint through physical agony. The mask of serenity was crafted specifically for this purpose, featuring a beautiful porcelain face that covered the wearer's natural features. But beneath the serene expression lay a network of pressure points and hidden spikes that responded to facial muscle movement. Any attempt to smile, frown, or show emotion would trigger pain so intense that the victim learned to maintain absolute stillness of expression. The mask forced royal brides to become living dolls, their faces frozen in artificial calm while their spirits screamed in silent anguish. Court painters of the era often depicted queens wearing these masks, though artistic convention disguised them as elaborate makeup or decorative face coverings. Modern art historians examining medieval royal portraits can identify the telltale signs of these devices in the unnaturally rigid expressions and hollow eyes of painted queens. What appear to be symbols of royal dignity were actually evidence of systematic torture designed to rob women of their humanity. The devices targeting royal brides' mobility reveal another dimension of medieval control over noble women. These instruments were designed to restrict movement in ways that appeared dignified and appropriate, while actually serving as constant reminders of powerlessness. A queen who attempted to leave her assigned chambers without permission, who walked too quickly through castle corridors, or who gestured too animatedly during conversations faced increasingly severe restrictions on her physical freedom. The regal restraint appeared to be an elaborate piece of court dress, featuring beautiful silk ribbons and golden chains that seemed to be decorative elements of royal fashion. But hidden within the elegant design were mechanisms that tightened with movement, creating a web of constraint that grew more painful the more the wearer attempted to assert her independence. The device allowed for graceful, measured movement appropriate to royal dignity while making any attempt at urgent or natural motion impossible. Royal brides wearing such devices learned to move like mechanical dolls, each gesture carefully calculated to avoid triggering the hidden mechanisms that would cause them pain. Court observers noted how queens seemed to glide rather than walk, how their hand movements became stylized and unnatural, how they seemed to exist in a bubble of artificial calm that separated them from the vibrant life of the court around them. The seasonal rituals of royal torture reached their most elaborate expression during what court documents called purification ceremonies. These events, timed to coincide with religious holidays, transformed the systematic abuse of royal brides into elaborate theatrical productions that involved the entire court. The ceremonies served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment for noble spectators, reinforced social hierarchies, and created shared complicity that bound court society together in collective guilt. During these events, royal brides were subjected to devices that combined multiple forms of torture into single horrifying experiences. The Crown of Thorns ceremony, performed during Easter week, required queens to wear elaborate headdresses embedded with actual thorns that would pierce the scalp and draw blood. The suffering was framed as religious devotion, with court chaplains leading prayers that praised the queen's willingness to share in Christ's passion. But the religious framework only intensified the psychological torture. Royal brides were forced to thank God for their suffering, to express gratitude for the pain that was supposedly purifying their souls and making them worthy of their royal positions. Court records preserve transcripts of these forced testimonials, documenting how broken women praised their torturers and begged for continued correction. The integration of torture into royal education reveals how these practices shaped entire generations of noble women. Young princesses destined for political marriages were exposed to torture devices from early childhood, not as victims but as observers learning what awaited them if they failed to meet expectations. Court tutors used miniature versions of adult torture devices to teach lessons about feminine obedience and royal duty. These educational sessions were presented as normal parts of royal upbringing, as essential as learning languages or musical instruments. Young girls were taught to identify different devices, to understand their purposes, and to appreciate the craftsmanship that went into their creation. They learned the proper responses to various torments, practicing the expressions of gratitude and submission that would be expected when they faced these instruments as adults. The psychological conditioning began so early that many royal brides entered marriage already broken, their spirits crushed before they ever faced actual torture. They had spent their entire lives preparing for systematic abuse, learning to see their future suffering as inevitable and even deserved. This preemptive psychological destruction ensured that resistance was rare and escape was unthinkable. The devices designed to punish royal brides for their intellectual capabilities represent perhaps the most tragic category of medieval torture instruments. These women had often received the finest educations available to their generation, mastering multiple languages, studying philosophy and theology, and developing political insights that could have benefited their kingdoms. But intellectual curiosity in a wife was seen as dangerous and unnatural, requiring immediate correction through specialized torments. The scholar's shame was a device that targeted the hands and fingers specifically, designed to make writing or reading impossible while leaving no visible permanent damage. The apparatus consisted of metal gloves fitted with internal spikes that would pierce the fingers whenever the wearer attempted fine motor movements. Royal brides subjected to this torture could still perform basic tasks required of queens, but they could no longer write letters, turn pages, or engage in any activity that might indicate independent thought. Court libraries often contained special sections of books that had been damaged by royal brides, forced to handle them while wearing such devices. The bloodstains on ancient manuscripts tell silent stories of intellectual women forced to destroy the very knowledge they loved. Some queens attempted to continue reading despite the pain, their desperate hunger for mental stimulation overcoming their fear of physical suffering. The destruction of royal brides' intellectual lives extended beyond individual torture to systematic isolation from ideas and information. Queens were forbidden to maintain correspondence with scholars or philosophers, denied access to new books or manuscripts, and prevented from participating in the intellectual discussions that had once given their lives meaning. They were transformed from thinking beings into decorative objects whose only permitted thoughts concerned their domestic duties and religious obligations. The devices targeting royal brides' maternal instincts reveal the depths of medieval cruelty toward noble women. Motherhood was supposedly the highest calling for royal wives, yet the very children they bore could become weapons used against them. Mothers who showed too much affection for their offspring, who attempted to influence their children's education, or who grieved too openly for children who died, faced tortures specifically designed to corrupt the maternal bond. The mother's burden was a device that forced royal brides to carry weighted representations of dead children, constantly reminded of their failures as mothers while being prevented from properly mourning their losses. The apparatus consisted of metal dolls crafted to resemble deceased royal infants, attached to the mother's body in ways that made normal movement difficult and sleep impossible. These metal children were often designed with features that moved or made sounds, creating the illusion of life while serving as constant reminders of death. Royal brides forced to carry these burdens often experienced psychological breaks that court physicians interpreted as evidence of feminine hysteria rather than symptoms of systematic torture. The devices transformed motherhood from a source of joy and purpose into a wellspring of endless grief and guilt. Even living children were used as instruments of torture against their royal mothers. Queens were forced to watch their offspring being subjected to educational punishments that were actually designed to break the maternal spirit. Mothers who attempted to protect their children faced escalating torments that made clear the price of maternal intervention. The economic aspects of royal bride torture reveal how these practices had become integrated into the broader political economy of medieval kingdoms. The creation and maintenance of torture devices represented significant investments that required ongoing funding and specialized labor. Court budgets included line items for torture equipment, skilled craftsmen commanded high wages for their expertise in creating new instruments, and entire industries developed around the systematic abuse of royal women. The most expensive devices were often given as diplomatic gifts between kingdoms, their elaborate craftsmanship serving as displays of wealth and technological sophistication. A particularly innovative torture device could enhance a kingdom's reputation among European courts, demonstrating both the ruler's commitment to maintaining proper feminine submission and his realm's advanced understanding of psychological control. Trade routes carried not just goods and ideas, but also techniques and technologies for royal bride torture. Master craftsmen traveled between courts sharing their expertise, creating networks of knowledge that ensured innovations in feminine subjugation spread quickly across Europe. Guild records preserve detailed accounts of these exchanges, documenting how torture techniques evolved and improved through international collaboration. The legal frameworks supporting royal bride torture reveal how thoroughly these practices had been integrated into medieval jurisprudence. Legal scholars wrote extensive treatises justifying the systematic abuse of royal women, creating philosophical foundations that transformed individual cruelty into social necessity. These legal arguments were so sophisticated and comprehensive that they influenced European law for centuries, establishing precedents that limited women's rights long after the specific torture practices had been abandoned. Court cases occasionally arose when royal brides died under torture, or when their families attempted to intervene on their behalf. The legal records of these proceedings provide chilling insights into how thoroughly society had accepted the systematic abuse of noble women. Judges routinely ruled that husbands had unlimited authority over their wives' bodies and souls, that any suffering endured by royal brides was either deserved punishment or necessary correction. The few attempts at legal reform were quickly suppressed by networks of nobles, clergy, and legal scholars who had vested interests in maintaining the system. Reformers who argued for limitations on husbands' authority over their wives faced accusations of heresy and sedition, their careers destroyed and their ideas suppressed. The legal system itself had become a weapon for perpetuating the torture of royal women. As we examine the final category of devices used against royal brides, we encounter instruments so specialized and cruel that they challenge our understanding of human capacity for systematic evil. These were tools designed not just to punish specific behaviors, but to destroy the very essence of feminine identity, transforming proud princesses into hollow shells whose only purpose was to serve as warnings to other women. The mirror of truth forced royal brides to confront their own degradation through a specially designed viewing apparatus that magnified and distorted their reflections while they endured other torments. The psychological impact of watching their own suffering was often more devastating than the physical pain itself, creating trauma that lasted long after the devices were removed. These final instruments represent the ultimate expression of medieval society's determination to break the spirits of royal women completely. They were not content merely to control behavior or punish disobedience. They sought to destroy the very possibility of resistance by eliminating every trace of independent thought or feeling from their victims' minds. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the immediate victims to shape European attitudes toward women for generations. The systematic torture of royal brides created a culture of fear that influenced how all women understood their place in society, establishing patterns of submission and control that would persist long after the specific devices had been relegated to museum collections. The complete erasure of individual identity represented the final and most devastating goal of royal bride torture. These were not mere punishments for specific transgressions, but systematic campaigns designed to transform thinking, feeling human beings into empty vessels whose only function was to serve as breeding stock and political symbols. The devices used in this final phase of psychological destruction were so sophisticated that they anticipated and countered every possible form of mental resistance or emotional survival. The confessor's chair represented the pinnacle of this psychological warfare. Appearing to be an ornate throne befitting a queen, it concealed mechanisms that monitored and punished every aspect of the victim's mental state. Hidden sensors detected changes in breathing, heart rate, and muscle tension, triggering corresponding adjustments in pressure points throughout the chair. A royal bride seated in this device could not even think rebellious thoughts without experiencing immediate physical consequences. The chair forced its occupants to achieve a state of complete mental emptiness, where any spark of independent thought or emotional response brought instant agony. Over time, royal brides learned to exist in a state of absolute psychological void, their minds as silent and empty as the stone walls of their prison chambers. Court observers noted how queens who had undergone this treatment seemed to disappear even while sitting in plain sight, their physical presence becoming a hollow shell containing nothing recognizable as human consciousness. The seasonal progression of torture revealed how thoroughly medieval courts had systematized the destruction of royal brides. Each phase of the calendar year brought new categories of devices and fresh justifications for escalating abuse. Spring ceremonies focused on fertility and reproductive function. Summer rituals emphasized submission and obedience. Autumn festivals targeted intellectual pride and independence, while winter observances completed the cycle by addressing spiritual rebellion and religious defiance. This calendar of cruelty ensured that royal brides never experienced relief or hope for improvement. Just as one type of torture ended, another began, creating an endless cycle of suffering that prevented psychological recovery or the development of resistance strategies. The seasonal nature also provided convenient religious and cultural justifications for each phase of abuse, transforming systematic torture into traditional observance that seemed natural and inevitable. Court chronicles describe elaborate ceremonies where multiple devices were applied simultaneously, creating spectacles of suffering that served as entertainment for noble audiences while demonstrating the complete powerlessness of royal women. These events followed carefully choreographed scripts that transformed individual agony into theatrical performance, with specific roles assigned to various courtiers and servants in the systematic degradation of their queens. The transformation of torture into entertainment reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval royal culture: the complete normalization of extreme cruelty toward women. What should have been horrifying displays of human suffering became sources of amusement and social bonding for court society. Nobles competed to suggest new refinements to existing devices. Artists created elaborate decorations for torture instruments, and poets composed verses celebrating the beauty of feminine submission achieved through systematic abuse. The international exchange of torture technologies created networks of cruelty that spanned medieval Europe. Royal courts maintained correspondence, sharing innovations in feminine subjugation, with ambassadors carrying detailed descriptions of new devices and techniques between kingdoms. Marriage negotiations often included discussions of torture protocols, with brides' families sometimes requesting specific assurances about the methods that would be used to ensure their daughter's proper behavior. These diplomatic exchanges normalized royal bride torture across European civilization, creating shared standards and expectations that made escape impossible even for women who might have found refuge in foreign courts. A princess fleeing her abusive husband discovered that every potential sanctuary operated according to the same principles and employed similar devices. The systematic nature of the abuse had created a continent-wide prison from which no royal woman could hope to escape. The medical establishment played a crucial role in legitimizing and refining royal bride torture. Court physicians developed elaborate theories about feminine psychology and anatomy that justified increasingly sophisticated forms of abuse. They wrote learned treatises describing how pain could correct supposed defects in women's moral and spiritual nature, creating scientific frameworks that transformed sadistic cruelty into medical treatment. These medical justifications were particularly insidious because they provided intellectual cover for practices that even medieval sensibilities might have questioned. When torture was framed as therapeutic intervention designed to cure feminine disorders, it became not just acceptable but morally necessary. Court physicians monitored royal brides during torture sessions, adjusting techniques to maximize psychological impact while ensuring that victims survived to endure further treatment. The corruption of medical knowledge in service of systematic abuse represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of healing arts. Physicians who had sworn to relieve suffering instead became architects of refined cruelty, using their understanding of human anatomy and psychology to inflict maximum damage while maintaining the fiction of therapeutic purpose. The educational aspects of royal bride torture extended beyond individual victims to shape entire generations of noble women. Young princesses throughout medieval Europe grew up knowing that their future happiness depended entirely on their ability to avoid the fate they witnessed being inflicted on their mothers, sisters, and other royal women. This knowledge created a culture of preemptive submission where resistance became literally unthinkable. The psychological conditioning began in earliest childhood through exposure to miniature torture devices presented as toys and educational tools. Young girls learned to associate femininity itself with suffering and submission, developing internalized beliefs about their own worthlessness that made external coercion unnecessary. By the time they reached marriageable age, most royal brides had already been broken in spirit, if not in body. This systematic conditioning created self-perpetuating cycles of abuse that continued across generations. Women who had been tortured into submission often became enthusiastic enforcers of the same system when they gained authority over younger women. Having lost all sense of their own worth and dignity, they could not imagine that other women deserved better treatment than they themselves had received. The economic infrastructure supporting royal bride torture reveals how deeply these practices had penetrated medieval society. Entire industries developed around the systematic abuse of noble women, from specialized craftsmen who created torture devices to servants who maintained them between uses. Guild records show that torture-related trades commanded premium wages and enjoyed high social status, indicating how thoroughly society valued expertise in feminine subjugation. The financial investments required for sophisticated torture programs meant that kingdoms competed to develop the most advanced techniques for breaking royal brides. Courts that could demonstrate superior methods for ensuring feminine submission gained diplomatic advantages and enhanced reputations among European nobility. The systematic abuse of women had become a mark of civilizational achievement rather than barbaric cruelty. Trade in torture technologies created international markets where innovations in feminine subjugation were bought and sold like any other commodity. Master craftsmen traveled between courts selling their expertise, while kingdoms invested in research and development programs designed to advance the science of royal bride torture. The economic incentives ensured continuous refinement and expansion of these practices across medieval Europe. The artistic and cultural celebration of royal bride torture reveals how completely these practices had been integrated into medieval aesthetic sensibilities. Court artists created beautiful sculptures and paintings depicting torture devices, transforming instruments of suffering into objects of artistic appreciation. Musicians composed elaborate pieces to accompany torture ceremonies, while poets wrote verses celebrating the beauty of feminine submission achieved through systematic abuse. These cultural productions served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They normalized extreme cruelty by presenting it within familiar artistic frameworks, making torture seem as natural and beautiful as any other aspect of court life. They also created permanent records of torture techniques and justifications that influenced future generations long after the original practitioners had died. The integration of torture into high culture ensured that the systematic abuse of royal women would be remembered not as historical atrocity, but as sophisticated social practice worthy of artistic celebration. Modern museum collections still contain artifacts from this period, though their true purposes are often disguised or minimized in contemporary descriptions that present them as curiosities rather than evidence of systematic torture. The religious dimensions of royal bride torture reveal how thoroughly medieval Christianity had been corrupted to serve the interests of masculine dominance. Church authorities not only blessed these practices, but actively developed theological justifications that made the systematic abuse of women into religious duty. They created elaborate doctrines explaining how feminine suffering served divine purposes and contributed to spiritual salvation. The corruption of religious authority was particularly devastating because it eliminated the last potential source of moral opposition to royal bride torture. When the church itself declared that systematic abuse of women served God's will, resistance became not just politically dangerous but spiritually damning. Royal brides found themselves cut off from any possible source of comfort or hope, abandoned by both earthly and divine authority. Religious torture devices often incorporated sacred imagery in ways that perverted spiritual meaning into instruments of suffering. Crosses became frameworks for restraint. Religious texts were used to justify specific torments, and prayer itself was transformed into a tool of psychological torture. The systematic corruption of spiritual symbols ensured that royal brides could find no refuge even in their own faith. The international legal frameworks that developed around royal bride torture created binding obligations that prevented any kingdom from offering genuine sanctuary to abused women. Treaties and diplomatic agreements included specific provisions requiring the return of escaped royal brides and the sharing of torture technologies between allied courts. These legal structures transformed individual cruelty into international law. The sophistication of these legal frameworks reveals how thoroughly medieval civilization had committed itself to the systematic abuse of royal women. What had begun as individual acts of domestic violence had evolved into complex institutional practices supported by law, religion, economics, and culture. The torture of royal brides had become a foundational element of medieval European civilization. The few attempts at resistance or reform were quickly crushed by the overwhelming institutional support for royal bride torture. Individual voices raised in opposition faced immediate persecution, while any kingdom that attempted to protect abused women found itself isolated and threatened by its neighbors. The system had become too deeply entrenched to allow for meaningful change. The psychological legacy of royal bride torture extended far beyond its immediate victims to shape European attitudes toward women for centuries after the specific practices had been abandoned. The systematic degradation of the most privileged women in society created cultural patterns that influenced how all women understood their place in the social order. The complete normalization of extreme cruelty toward royal brides established precedents that justified lesser forms of abuse against women of all social classes. If queens could be systematically tortured without moral objection, then the mistreatment of common women became not just acceptable but inevitable. The torture of royal brides created a cultural permission structure for the oppression of all women. The transformation of systematic abuse into entertainment and artistic celebration ensured that these practices would be remembered fondly rather than condemned. Medieval literature and art preserved idealized images of feminine submission achieved through torture, creating cultural narratives that influenced European attitudes toward women long after the original practices had ended. As we reach the end of this dark journey through medieval history, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the systematic torture of royal brides was not an aberration or exception, but a logical extension of medieval attitudes toward women and power. These practices developed naturally from cultural beliefs about feminine inferiority and masculine authority that were shared across European civilization. The devices waiting in castle dungeons represented more than individual cruelty. They embodied the collective will of an entire civilization committed to the systematic oppression of women. The torture of royal brides was not the work of isolated sadists, but the product of sophisticated institutions that devoted enormous resources and intellectual energy to perfecting methods of feminine subjugation. The stories we have explored remind us that behind every beautiful castle and glittering court lay chambers where the most privileged women in society endured systematic torture designed to break their spirits and reduce them to hollow shells. These women, who should have been protected by their royal status, instead became victims of the very system that elevated them, their suffering serving as entertainment for the nobles who surrounded them. Their legacy challenges us to remember that human cruelty knows no bounds when it becomes institutionalized and normalized, that civilization itself can become a weapon against the vulnerable, and that the price of progress is often paid by those who have no voice in determining its direction. The medieval torture of royal brides stands as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic evil disguised as social necessity. In remembering these forgotten victims, we honor not just their individual suffering, but the countless women throughout history who have faced similar fates in societies that valued their utility over their humanity. Their stories echo across the centuries, demanding that we remain vigilant against the forces that would reduce human beings to political commodities and transform systematic abuse into cultural tradition. The chambers where these tortures took place still stand in castles across Europe, their stone walls keeping silent vigil over secrets too dark for most historical accounts. But their silence speaks volumes about the price of power, the cost of political marriage, and the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance in the face of systematic oppression.